Alright, so you might have noticed that on actual amp heads, there are usually a couple of ports on the back. One that says send, that's an output, and then you have an input that's called return. And you might have read somewhere that that serves the purposes of creating a so-called effects loop, and you're wondering, okay, how do I implement that in GarageBand? So very briefly, I'm going to show you what that actually is and why it's useful, and I'm going to show you how to actually recreate that in GarageBand. So first, let's load up an instance of our amp designer so that we have something to look at. Let's ignore the cabinet for a second. Let's just focus on the amp head, and it's divided into two sections for the most part, right? You've got your preamp section, so that comprises your gain knob and your EQ knobs, right? Bass, mid, and treble. Those are kind of self-explanatory, so let's not worry about them. Then in GarageBand you have this effects section. I'm going to turn that off and ignore that. And then the other important part is the power amp, right? So that's usually just your master knob here. In this case we also have a presence knob, but that also is a bit like an EQ, right? It boosts your high mids, so we can ignore that as well and just worry about the master knob here. So what is the difference between this master knob, which is a volume knob in the end, right? And the gain knob at the beginning of your preamp, which is also a volume knob, right? Come to think of it, what's the difference between those? Well, the difference is that the gain knob is driving your signal into the amplifier, and so the more volume you add to that signal, the louder, I should say, you make it, the more your amplifier is gonna color that signal, it's gonna distort that signal, right? And that is not a side effect, that is what you want. That's the reason why your Vox AC30, which I have right here, sounds different than, say, your Fender Tweed amp, right? Because they color your signal differently when you drive them, right? So this is for signal coloring, for tone shaping. On the other hand, your master knob on the end of the power amp is just a very transparent and neutral volume slider, right? So the tone you already created, you're just making it quieter or louder. You know, even at low volumes, you still have your distorted tone if you cranked up the gain. And at high levels, you still have that same tone. It's just going to be a little louder. So now that we've understood this, let's see why we actually need a send return kind of configuration. Send return means that your signal is going to leave your amp head after the preamp section. So you can dial in the amount of gain you want to shape your tone the way you want it. Then it's going to leave your amp. Then you can connect a bunch of effects to it. We're talking reverb, delay, flangers, choruses, phasers, that sort of stuff. And then your signal comes back in just before the power amp, okay? So why would you want to connect those time-based effects or pedals inside of this effect loop rather than just on your way into your amp, so before your gain knob here? Well, the reason is very simple. Imagine that you had, say, a delay, right, going into your amplifier. Now, you crank up the gain. That is not only going to distort your actual dry signal, but also all of those delay taps. So you have your guitar tone, you have some copies of it, which are the delay taps, and then you're distorting those delay taps as well as your original tone. And that can lead to your tone getting muddy, losing a lot of clarity. So the idea is that you want to keep things as dry as possible when entering your preamp. Use your gain knob to dial in the exact amount of distortion that you're happy with. And once you have the tone, then you can use delays, reverbs, and those kind of effects. And that is also why most of the pedals that you want to use on your way in don't really have a mix knob, right? So let's actually recreate what a typical signal chain would look like. So I'm going to open up an instance of the pedalboard here. First thing you would want to use is pitch-based effects, because these work best with an unaltered signal. So you plug in your guitar straight into that pedal and it's going to work best. Then you might want to shape your tone a bit with an EQ. So let's put in an EQ. Maybe you have a wah pedal as well. This is nothing but a low-pass filter, so a sort of EQ as well. Then maybe you want to even out your tone from a dynamic standpoint of view, so you want to use a compressor to keep your signal consistent. And then you might want to use a distortion pedal as well, like this one, right? So except for the whammy, right, which has this mix knob, so you can mix in between your original octave and the extra octave you added, all of these, they are going to color all of your tone. Like with this EQ, you don't have a mix knob between the unscathed signal and the processed signal, right? You are affecting the whole signal. Same with the wah, same with the compressor, same with the distortion pedal. So these are all pedals that you can use to sculpt your tone. And then you go into your amplifier, right? And you sculpt your tone even further with the amplifier's distortion. Then your EQ, you want to boost the mids, the lows, or cut the highs, whatever it is you want to do, you can sculpt your tone even further. And that is when your tone creating process should stop, right? At this point, you have the tone you want, and you can add some effects on top of that. But those effects are going to take your already completed tone and add a little something to it. A delay will add some copies of the signal, a reverb will add some reflections, early and late reflections, etc. So at this point, we want to send our signal out of the amp head into all of those time-based effects and then back into our power amp part, right? So that when we use the master knob here, we don't actually increase the distortion, the harmonic coloration of the amp, and then we can go to our cab. So that is extremely useful not to lose clarity in your signal. You don't want to distort those delay taps and reverb reflections and what have you. Later on, when we actually insert those time-based effects, you will notice that almost all of them do have a mix knob between dry and wet. So you are mixing copies of the signal or reflections or what have you with your original tone, which you already have created with your pedals before your amp head and your preamp section. So I hope that was clear. Now, in GarageBand, it might seem impossible to create that kind of routing, because the way GarageBand works is you have your pedal board like this one, and then you have your amp head and your cabinet in the same kind of plugin here, right? So how can we recreate that kind of send return effects loop kind of scenario? Well, we can do it. The only slight difference is that rather than sending the signal out of the amp head at the preamp stage and then bringing it back in just before the power amp stage, we are actually bringing it back in after the power amp stage. But that is actually not going to make a big difference. Like, we can just set this to, 0 dB here and to the mid position here, and we're going to be good to go. In this scenario, it really doesn't make a difference if we come back in before this, because we're not applying any more or less volume, right? We still preserve the most important part, which is to shape your tone with your preamp section and then apply your effects before hitting the cabinet. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put in those reverb, delay, flanger pedals in between the amp head and the cabinet. And the way to do that is first eliminate the cabinet from here. And that is pretty easy. As you can see, there is a drop-down menu here that says cabinet. All the cabinets you can choose from are here, but you could also choose to go direct, right? As you can see, there is no cab selected when you do that. Brilliant. So now we have created the possibility to insert a new pedal board just after the amp head, right? And this time around, we're going to use our modulation pedals. So if you have a tremolo, you would put it here, a flanger or a phaser, that's good too, a chorus, of course, and then of course your time-based effects like delay and reverb. That would be your typical kind of pedal configuration you would use here. So those you want to put after you're done with your tone shaping. Those are kind of like ambience effects. But you want to have your tone right before hitting them. You don't want them being part of what creates your tone in the first place. So right, we have our amp going into these effects. And as you can see, there's a mix knob here, there's a mix knob here. Density here is kind of like a mix knob, etc., etc. So you've guessed it, now we can bring back our cab. So let's insert another amp designer here. You might have noticed that we don't really have a direct option like we had with the cab, but we do have a transparent preamp. And what that means is that even if you crank the gain here, this is not going to create extra harmonic content. In other words, it's not going to distort your signal. It works pretty much like the master knob on the power amp section of your amp head. And so we want to do even less than that. We don't even want to boost our signal. We just want to set everything here to neutral, no effects, presence, and with everything set to 12 o'clock like this, effectively you're just sending your signal through unscathed, right? So basically we're bypassing the head here. We're only keeping our cab, and of course now you can choose your microphone and you can put it where you feel it sounds best. So yeah, again, let's have a look at our signal here. Our guitar goes into our first pedal board here. We are altering the pitch with the whammy. This works best on an unaltered signal, so we're plugging the guitar straight into that. That's our first pedal. Then we have our EQs, our dynamics, our compressor, and our distortion pedals. So that's our first layer of tonal shaping. Then we're shaping our tone even further with our amp head, especially the gain knob for extra amp distortion, the EQ section if we need to cut some bass or mids or highs. We even have this extra treble knob. This one we're gonna ignore because we don't need to mess with it. Then this is where our tone is complete. What we want to do now is we want to enhance a tone that is already there with some time-based effects, be it a tremolo or a flanger or phaser, chorus, delay, reverb. This is going to be our kind of time-based section. And finally, we have our cab and the microphone, the placement of which is going to change the tone even further. But that's kind of your best practice guitar signal change. So I would recommend you try this out. This really gives you more clarity in your signal. And if you already have some presets made with the traditional kind of configuration, what I would suggest is put those on a track, then duplicate your track, and on the second track, while keeping the same settings for the pedals and the amplifier, just use this configuration instead. So, disable the cab on your first instance of the amp designer, create a second one where you go through the transparent preamp, and then keep your cab there, and in between those put an extra pedal board, and all the time-based effects that you had on your first pedal board, you just want to put them on the second pedal board, and then go back and forth between those two tracks and see if you don't get much more clarity with this kind of approach. So yeah, that's all I have for you today. I hope this was useful to you, and if so, let me know. Shoot me a comment. If you got any questions, shoot me a comment as well. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video next week. Take care.